Salu peleka salamu kutoka Dar es Salaam, zifikishe mpaka Lamu, pwani ya Mombasa, pamoja kabini Haji. Yale aliyoandika leo yanatimilika, Simba ndume na Wambuji, sikizani tatongoa, na ketile vitongoji vya safari za mashua. Sasa nakumbuka mbiji ya kutweka na kutua, haipato na mpewa zitakapo kukutana.
Hello and welcome back to Afrikanists Assemble. With our question this month, we wanted to delve into the topic of oral literature and verbal arts. A lot of our contributors have many years of experience in this field, so we asked them, let's pretend that you've been given a generous yearly budget and the task of creating a way to highlight and celebrate great African oral literature. What initiative would you create and what would it look like? Have fun listening to all the answers.
Kwa mfano, ningepewa hela nyingi nilizotengewa katika bajeti ya kila mwaka kwa minajili ya kusherehekea fasihi simulizi za Kiafrika. Je, ningefanya nini na hali ingekuwa vipi? Kwanza kabisa, ningeweka pamoja timu ya vijumbe wa kusanya taarifa na data, pamoja na vyombo mbalimbali vya kale vinavyohusu tamaduni za Kiafrika. Licha ya kwamba vitu hivi ni vya kiutamaduni, ni lazima viwe vinafungamana na fasihi simulizi. Vile ningeunda kituo cha fasihi simulizi za Kiafrika ambacho kingekuwa na vitengo viwili vikuu. Kitengo cha kwanza kingekuwa kama maktaba au makavazi ya kuhifadhi na kutunza vyombo aina vya fasihi simulizi za Kiafrika kama vile ala za muziki zikiwemo ngoma, zumari, zeze, marimba, chivoti, kayamba, matare, alimradi zinatoka katika jamii tofauti za Kiafrika. Pamoja na ala hizo, pia tungekusanya vifaa vingine vya utendaji, kwa mfano maleba yanayotumika katika sherehe na ngoma za majigambo, ngoma za harusi, sherehe za matanga na shughuli nyingine za kimila. Vile tungeleta pamoja nyaraka, michoro, picha na ramani za maeneo ya utendaji wa fasihi simulizi. Tungekusanya rekodi za nyimbo, muziki, ngoma na matambiko mbalimbali. Kitengo cha pili kingekuwa na ukumbi wa utendaji wa vipera vya fasihi simulizi za Kiafrika kama vile maigizo, ushairi simulizi, majigambo, utambaji hadithi, uwasilishaji wa semi na matambiko. Ukumbi huu ungepambwa kwa vinyago na ufinyanzi wa picha za mashujaa wa simulizi za kale, wakiwemo Fumo Liyongo, Luanda Magere, Sundiata wa Mandingo, Shaka Zulu, Mekatilili wa Menza, Wangu wa Makeri, miongoni mwa wengine. Pia ukumbi huu vile ungetumika kama kituo muhimu cha utamaduni na kuandaa tamasha mbalimbali zinazofungamana na fasihi simulizi za Kiafrika na maonyesho ya utamaduni.
I love a good celebration, especially if I'm not part of the organizing group. If I'm just one of the laughing and dancing masses, I love a good celebration. But this one is tricky. Oral literature encompasses so many diverse things. There are so many genres that works in very different ways that it then becomes challenging to think of celebrating it in a single way. Maybe one will be forced to think of some multimedia festival and things like that. Even that will still get us in some serious difficulties. I'm thinking once you cut off these texts, I'll just call them texts for now. If you cut off these texts from the social contexts that they come out of, that give them meaning, that they speak to, then the whole thing becomes different. It's no longer oral literature in the way that it ought to be understood. And therefore, what we are left with is something strangish, So how do we bypass that challenge and put it up in a way? Because we could do festival, and this is fun, where we have, all these artists and all these consumers of art assembling at one particular place, enjoying the performances and so on. But you find that many of our genres are, again, the kinds of things that blur that distinction between artist and audience and all these kinds of things. So for this one, I want to listen very keenly to experts like Okongo of oral literature. I got to a point where I consider oral literature part of everyday life, everyday realities, and so on. And therefore, celebrating oral literature apart from the everyday becomes challenging for me. But I wait to hear from others.
The first thing that comes to mind when I imagine having funding to create a project to celebrate African oral literature is one set of poems that especially interest me in Swahili, the Fumo Liyongo poems. These were poems that I first seriously thought about years ago when I was working in the Swahili manuscripts collection at SOAS University of London. The sphere of oral literature in African languages is so vast and rich. In a sense, the only way I can think about it is by focusing on a tiny sliver of literature that's particularly fascinating to me or close to my heart. A little orienting might be useful. Fumo Liyongo is a mythical hero in Kenya and Tanzania. Despite efforts by local intellectuals and by scholars, not much is understood about correspondence with a living person or persons, and I think as time passes, fewer and fewer people even know the name Fumo Liyongo. The songs and poems associated with him are varied in form and in variety of Swahili. There's also a prose story, I think. In one of the poems, Fumo Liyongo says he sails only in water too deep for an anchor to touch bottom. Sometimes Fumo Liyongo is an escape artist, almost a superhero. Sometimes he's a lyrical love poet. I'd use my funding to form collaborative groups across Eastern Africa, especially in Kenya and Tanzania, tasked with exploring, interpreting, and ultimately performing and presenting the corpus of Liyongo poems, songs, and narrative to audiences. Each group, and maybe a group would be 10 to 12 people, but a couple of groups could be bigger, and a couple could also be smaller. Each group would ideally encompass participants of different ages. Some groups could vary in terms of the occupation or background of participants, a farmer alongside, a musician alongside a cook, alongside a university scholar or a visual artist, for example. But a couple of groups could be formed based on shared vocational interest. What if one group, for example, consisted largely of tailors and designers of clothes? I'm thinking of the many references to outfits and accessories in the songs and poems. And after, let's say, a nice salaried year working together, each group could ultimately perform or present the Liyongo corpus in a medium or multiple media that made sense to them. Would they like to perform them on stage with music and dance? Would they render the corpus as visual art? Would they turn it into theater? And maybe translation into other African languages could be part of some groups' work to experiment with making or remaking a Liyongo poem in Haya or Gikuyu or Luo.
Adabin baka taskira ce ta ilimi da dabarun tafiyar da rayuwa gaba ɗaya. Wato ya wuce labarai, waƙoƙi da wasan kwaikwayo da za a saurara don nishaɗi. Misali, adabin baka yana ɗauke da ilimin magani, gine-gine, kimiyya da fasaha da sauransu. Waɗannan hanyoyi ne da mutane da dama suka dogara da su wajen tafiyar da rayuwarsu a dubban shekaru da suka gabata, tun kafin su fara alaƙa da wasu mutane daga wajen nahiyar. Saboda haka, a cikin adabin baka za mu gane cewar mutanen nahiyar Afirka suna da hanyoyin ci gaba da amfani da ƙere-ƙere da fasaha domin sauƙaƙa rayuwa da zamantakewa. Idan na samu kuɗin samar da hanyoyin nuna ci gaban adabin baka, to lallai zan mayar da hankali akan labarai da waƙoƙi da sauransu masu ɗauke da kimiyya da fasaha. Wannan zai fito da yadda ake fuskantar matsalolin rayuwa tun daga ƙanana har zuwa manya-manyan su a mahangar mutanen Afirka. Wannan zai taimaka ƙwarai da gaske wajen fito da ilimi da za su amfanar da duniya a yau. Yana daga cikin matsalar da mulkin mallaka ya haifar, kashe fannonin ilimin kimiyya da fasaha na gargajiya a Afirka. Idan har aka bayar da ƙarfi wajen tono waɗannan hanyoyi, wataƙila duniya za ta samu sabon salon tafiyar da rayuwa. Zan ji daɗin fito da sababbin hanyoyi domin duniya ta samu sababbin madubban kallon rayuwa fiye da waɗanda ake da su a yau. Akwai yiwuwar samun ci gaba mai ɗorewa idan har aka yi amfani da kimiyya da fasahar nahiyar Afirka wajen kallon mafi yawan matsalolin da ke damun duniya a yau, tun daga ɗumamar yanayi zuwa cututtuka da sauransu.
To start with, let me tell you about what I do to celebrate the verbal art of the Iraqu of Tanzania. My main academic concern is to understand this language and other languages in Africa. Verbal art is for me a source of pleasure, and I enjoy sharing that with other people. But with whom? With the Iraqu in Tanzania and with my countrymen in the Netherlands. In the past, I have printed storybooks in Iraqu and Swahili, but they ended up being carefully stored in a box. Nice, but who reads it? My next attempt is to make them available in an app called Bloom, so that people can read the stories in both languages on their phones and can easily share them. You can also watch the videos on our YouTube channel Iraqu Research Materials with captions in both Swahili and Iraqu. And the website verberafrikaner.org represents them with an analysis for an academic audience. But how can I reach my friends and neighbors? They don't speak Iraqu and not Swahili, and even translating the Iraqu stories to English or Dutch is not enough to let them appreciate this art. We are now in the process of retelling the stories for a Dutch audience and to include them in our popular website stemmenvanafrika.nl. This retelling and an analysis that goes with it is a kind of cultural translation that brings true value to diversity. As a teacher, I want that budget of this month's question to initiate the next step to entice and empower you to do this cultural translation. But who are you? What I have in mind is to have teams of speaker researchers that collect and display the verbal art of their language. In the last years, I have seen the beginning of that with my partner in crime, Basilis Hau, who records Iraqu verbal art, history and cultural heritage with her video and audio equipment and transcribes and translates it. This is a beginning, and I would like to see such teams for many languages and to be sustainable and to expand their activities. Most of all, I envisage enabling conversation between these language teams and engaged students in Tanzania and my own students in Leiden, but also my friends and neighbors who are reading the retold, revamped versions of the stories. Conversations about how to understand these stories, this verbal art. That is what I mean with you doing the cultural translation.
Given a generous yearly budget to highlight and celebrate the great African oral literature, I would be spoiled for choice over which African oral literature to showcase. African societies for a long time had and still do have a great depth of oral traditions. These traditions are diverse and are unique in their own way. Focusing on oral literature and with a generous yearly budget, I would embark on a documentation and a dissemination project of these literatures of the various communities, which I would group according to their genealogies. Priority would be given to the endangered oral traditions in order to safeguard the knowledge and the values that they convey, as well as preserve and, where possible, revitalize the languages in which these oral traditions are presented in. My documentation and dissemination project would employ a multidisciplinary approach that would highlight and celebrate the diversity as well as the brilliance of the various oral genres. Anthropological documentation would be key in highlighting these art, that captures the spirit, civilization, as well as the virtues of their respective societies. This documentation would further be interpreted and translated into the various global languages where it would help in communicating across different cultures and across different languages. A lot of emphasis would be laid on community participation in settings that would encourage the flow of these genres from the older generation to the younger generations. In a country like Kenya, where drama and music festivals are encouraged and practiced within the school setup, whereby they showcase the various oral cultures of the various communities found in Kenya, my project would come up with ways of creating partnerships that are mutually beneficial for these two groups. Being the 21st century, the project would entail audiovisual recordings of the brilliant performances of narratives, oral poetry, song, dance, as well as various rituals among the numerous genres within select communities to create a repository for future generations as well as for dissemination purposes.
If I am given a budget to sponsor an initiative in oral literature in Africa, I want to go back to my hometown and to my village in Babanki in Cameroon. Back in my village, there was this initiative of oral literature where mothers and fathers used to pass on to their children oral literature, something that was done mostly in the night. You know, there was this culture of after every work has been done, after dinner has been taken, children sit around their parents and they do some readers, they do some oral literature. Now, an example of what they used to do, especially for readers, when the parents want to start these readers, they used to start, there is a way of to show that you're the one speaking. You used to say, as somebody who is always about to give out a reader, you start by saying monga. When you say monga means you're about to give a reader. And then those who are about to receive in order to connote the reader or in order to be able to interpret the reader, they are going to answer that chinga. And when you do this, you're going to give a reader. An example of a reader used to be like, for example, in my language, someone will say Ktemke Feke, and then Ktemke Feke meant or means a black sea or a black river. And then the response in most cases, for those who knew it, they will say Bem. And Bem now means the stomach. So Ktemke Feke means a black river, and then the response to that, or the interpretation to that is Bem, which is stomach. So this was so much fun, and children were really learning from this. And this culture was also carried, not just, it wasn't in the village, it was also extended into the city, because those of us in the city, we actually learned because our parents equally brought this culture, and we used to learn. It used to be so much fun time in all of this. In the side of storytelling, for your mother to start telling a story, or for any other person to start telling a story, they are going to start like tea. And when they say tea, we are going to answer bo. So this means a story is about to be told. And this opportunity, they use this opportunity to tell stories in order to bring up children in a fearful manner, in a respectful manner, because they gave stories that actually taught us that if you do not do some things, there is a risk of actually having a kind of punishment. So if I am to do this initiative, I will do an initiative where I'm going to sponsor a competition where children in the city, in the villages, I want to know the children who still know the highest number of readers, highest number of stories in the local languages. And then they are going to have prizes, like really huge prizes. This is going to encourage this culture to keep on moving, so that parents should keep on telling these stories to their children. When they hear there is a competition, people will get back to work, and they're going to know how important this culture has always been, and it's going to continue actually in my village.
The celebration of great African literature should first highlight those oral literature that have been categorized as great across Africa. There are two types of African literature: the researched and the raw oral literature from the storyteller. Both are scattered across Africa. Therefore, the process of identifying and highlighting them should be established. This is the first thing to be done. This could be sourced from available oral literature scholars and storytellers from across Africa. The initiative to celebrate great African oral literature could best be a conference for scholars and storytellers. These could be zoned into 5 regions of Africa rotationally: West Africa, South Africa, North Africa, East Africa, and Central Africa. Then we can effectively celebrate great African oral literature and even create an avenue to harvest more across Africa. Specifically, and also very significantly, the celebration of raw African literature will yield the best of results if it is organized in form of a festival. Every aspect of the event should be recorded. The festival should be programmed as a competition with a view to get the best from participants. In order to achieve objectives, Light Award should be presented in addition to full sponsorship of the conference or festival. These should be repeated at different areas with different groups across Africa. Then, the celebration of African oral literature would have started.
If I had time and money, I would make an effort to put ancient Swahili poetry on stage so that it can be heard. For the last years, I've been working with a group of scholars on the translation of Swahili poetry, which dates back to the early 19th century. It has mostly been attributed to one of the most fascinating and charismatic leaders and poets, Bwana Zaidi Mngumi, from the island of Lamu in northern Kenya. He lived in the late 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century and was a great master poet and a clever politician and military leader. So in 1812, he managed to do the impossible. His troops defeated the much more powerful alliance of the neighboring city-states of Pate and Mombasa in the so-called Battle of Shela, which had quite an impact on the region. Before meeting his opponents on the battlefield, Bwana Zaidi Mngumi normally engaged in verbal duels with them. And his boastful poetry has fascinated people ever since. So old people on Lamu still remember very much his very powerful verses. Like, for instance, Hatuchi situtisheni hatuituki mishindo. Tangu kale na zamani tu wazoevu wa kondo. We don't fear, don't scare us. We are not frightened of your clamor. From time immemorial, we've been accomplished fighters. Already in the 19th century, people felt the need to preserve his poetry, and they wrote them down in Arabic script. And, well, these are some of the earliest poems from East Africa we have evidence of. And in the last years, we have been working on these manuscripts in Arabic script. That's a group of Abdelatif Abdallah and Biersteker, Annmarie Drury, Anna Chiara Raya, Mahmoud Mau, Farouk Topan, Rida Samson, and Ahmed Parker. We do it as a group because reading this difficult poetry in the manuscripts, that can only be done collectively. The poetry is full of allusions, lots of metaphors, the language is not easy, and the poetry is clearly born out of a context of oral dance performances, so many references to musical instruments. So we've worked on this poetry a lot, but we do not know at all how this poem sounded, how they were danced. We've never heard them. And the dances actually do not exist anymore in this way. In November last year, so my colleague Ute Fendler and me, we organized a workshop with arts from all over the Indian Ocean. So photography, poetry, dance. And Abdelatif Abdallah and me, we were supposed to talk about the poetry and also read a few poems that we had worked on. And afterwards, the Malagasy musician Tao Rawao was supposed to play the Malagasy Waliha, accompanying the Mozambican contemporary dancer Luis Sala. And suddenly then Tao suggested to integrate the Swahili poetry into the performance. But then listening to us, Tao said we were reading the poems as if we were reading a computer manual. So I particularly had to learn to listen more to his music, but also to the poem's language, the rhythm, the larger-than-life characters, and the threatening tone. Well, and in the end, we certainly did not do any archaeological reconstruction. So drums, rather than a Malagasy string instrument, seem to have been the original instruments in the poem. And the dancing style was certainly also different compared to Lulu's sensitive enactment of violence and fragility, which we then saw on stage. And still, I was surprised how much the performance, so us communally passing on emotions of danger, threat, and chivalry, how much this actually revealed about the poems, how much they were actually brought to life, and how much it also opened up possibilities for the audience to connect with the beauty of this terribly difficult poetry from the early 19th century. And it did not only appear to me as very locally specific, but really as coming with grand universal gestures as well. So if I had money, I would invite more artists to explore the richness of oral traditions and to invite them to experiment with them. And rather than trying to merely preserve heritage, the question for me has become more how to make it reverberate so that it affects a contemporary audience.
I find this question very interesting because I've been looking forward to a great storytelling festival. I would like a setting of a garden or hall with a projector at the background. This is to say, the storytelling time will be in the evening, a 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. program. Renowned storytellers will be invited and grouped into different categories. For example, 2 folktales, 2 narratives, 2 legendary or epic stories. Where the stories are in any African language, it can be recorded and translated. While the recorded version is being played out loud, the translated version will be displayed on the projector for audience to read. At intervals, there will be poem recitation and music performance. A very good and generous budget will go a long way.
With funding and given the chance to initiate an oral literature project in Africa, I would work on a project I envision and for which I am currently exploring possibilities. I am thinking of ways to bridge the gap between oral literature researchers, local archivists, and orators themselves, who I view as indigenous knowledge experts. Presently, a gap exists between these three entities. Researchers may know and interact with excellent orators, but these orators may not be known by local archivists who, despite their limited capacity, are trying to document knowledge carried in oral forms. On the other hand, research findings remain largely inaccessible to the communities among which the research was carried out. Involving orators and the community at large would therefore provide a platform for orators to understand the value of the wealth of knowledge that they share with researchers. This will in turn encourage orators to continue sharing this knowledge and to continuously impart the knowledge that they have on the younger generation, which would ensure continuity. I would also create a database of both established and emerging indigenous knowledge experts and orators. Creating such a database will make it easy for other researchers and archivists to access indigenous knowledges of communities in question, and this will popularize oral literature. In summary, I would build a community-based documentation and archiving project.
What initiative would I create? And what would that look like? Let me simply bring you into a picture of a project and a proposal gathering dust called MALI, Mobile African Language Institute. The Mobile African Language Institute is something that we have thought about for many years, but have been unfortunate to get any buyers or funders for. And basically what the Mobile African Language Institute is for is to move around capitals of the world, different state capitals in different countries, moving with experts in different African languages and also verbal arts. If there's anything about the African language, it's the ability to create sounds, even if they do not understand, to create sounds and create moods and draw out emotions on the canvas of the minds of the people. How wonderful it would be if I could get a year's budget. I would sing the song that Coca-Cola sang at a particular time. I want the world to come and know African oral history. I want the world to come and know about African oral literature. It's a doable thing. Yes, that would be my song. That would be the theme, that it is possible to move from county to world levels to different capitals and staying in farmers market and having the different African languages come aboard the Mobile African Language Institute bus. It will travel across the length and breadth of different countries and performing at the doorsteps of the markets, the grocery stores, the shopping malls, and handing out leaflets that would encourage people to know more and also to follow the progress that we're making, promoting African verbal arts and oral literature across the world. It is very possible.
Ejimi Nupe tinye Nigeria waike ala ewo na kunye na yamina mi awagan ni mi etwa guta ndondo mi ga asibi nini shishi ebo lila tula yan dandan Nupe fi sanwo yan zaman ke radio television na shiri nana ade etan pin yan Nupe chiji le lawo yan eniko dandan Nupe tita yan echinji ni mi Nupio to ganchiji ni mi Nupio na yebo na shiri iri na jidan sanwo zamanjo shiboliani ama egiji yan gbani yegan ala ankali tua ebogabo be lila tula kamindondo yan dandan Nupe be amfani yan sanwo zamayin wọn be ladaye tili be nanayin eto akuta mafari yi ya etan pin yan Nupe chiji eto aguta bachi yi ya lilawu yan eniko dandan Nupe eto aguta tachi yi ya tita yan echinji Nupio eto aguta nichi yi ya tita ganchiji ni mi Nupio be nanayin ni yan mi na mi ajin amfani be sanwo zamayin na mi ala dandan Nupe tula ya yije patana.
Those were all responses for this month. As always, leave a comment and tell us what your concept for an oral literature initiative would look like. What about the variety of genres that are summarized under that term, or the question of performance and audience? Thanks so much for listening to this episode. Subscribe to our channel to get notified as soon as we post a new one. See you then.
Salut. Salut. Salut kitoka Lamu, urudi Dar es Salaam. Ukipita ya bahari, ushukie Zanzibari. Salamu kwa Haji Gola, heshima kwa Haji Gola. Kimbunga alichoandika leo kimeshatufika. Kimbunga mji wa Siyu kilichowahi kufika si kwa yule